Bindi has talked often about wanting her daughter to grow up surrounded by the same conservation values that shaped her own childhood. For a while, she appeared to be juggling motherhood, the day-to-day demands of running parts of the family operation, and a long-running reality series with the same calm composure fans had watched her carry since she was a little girl. What almost nobody outside her closest circle knew was that Bindi had been quietly living with unexplained pain for more than a decade. She has since described being repeatedly told by doctors that what she was feeling was simply a normal part of being a woman, even as the pain grew worse every month. It wasn't until 2023 that she finally received an answer. Endometriosis, a condition where tissue similar to the uterine lining grows outside the uterus, often causing severe pain that can take years to properly diagnose. She traveled internationally for surgery, and doctors removed dozens of lesions in that first procedure alone. Over the following years, further surgeries removed even more tissue, along with a cyst and her appendix, plus a separate procedure to repair a hernia connected to her daughter's birth. Rather than keep that struggle private, Bindi eventually chose to share it in detail, posting hospital photos and writing candidly about what it felt like to be trapped in a body that seemed to be working against her for years before anyone could explain why. That openness turned her into one of the more visible faces of endometriosis awareness within celebrity media, and by the spring of 2026 her family confirmed she was doing noticeably better, even though travel still remained difficult enough that she skipped an annual family fundraising gala in person for the first time, choosing instead to stay closer to home in Australia and ease back into hands-on wildlife work at her own pace. That recovery has unfolded alongside a return to the parts of conservation work that matter most to her, particularly caring for the park's crocodile population. Her brother has pointed out that her presence carries real weight given the scale of what the family manages these days, an operation that now employs several hundred staff across an enormous stretch of conservation land. Even during her hardest stretches, Bindi found it strangely easier on her body to spend time with animals at home than to travel for public appearances, and that shift has quietly reshaped how the public sees her. The cheerful young wildlife presenter fans remembered from her childhood has given way to a more complete picture. A woman who suffered in silence for years while still showing up on camera and continuing her work, and who has since become part of a broader cultural push toward taking chronic conditions like hers seriously. While Bindi was working through that private battle largely out of the spotlight, her younger brother was quietly building toward one of the biggest moments of his own career, and almost nobody saw it coming the way it eventually arrived. Robert spent much of his childhood as the quieter of the two Irwin kids, often standing beside his mother and sister rather than commanding attention the way Bindi naturally did from such a young age. While his sister moved early into television hosting, public speaking, and high-profile conservation projects, Robert spent more time observing from the sidelines and developing his own interests away from the intense focus that had followed the family since the earliest days of the original show. As he grew into his teenage years, that started to change. He gradually took on bigger roles in the park's educational programming and showed a natural ability to connect with audiences while staying true to his own passions. With Bindi managing her recovery from home and Robert riding the momentum of his newfound television career, the family's public-facing work has settled into something built around shared responsibility rather than a single dominant figure. Terry, now in her 60s, continues overseeing daily operations at the park, while her two adult children take on increasingly visible roles in both the conservation side of the business and the media projects that keep the family name in front of new audiences. Robert has kept expanding his presence well beyond the dance floor, balancing zoo responsibilities with filming commitments that have taken him internationally in the time since his win. Bindi, meanwhile, has leaned into a quieter chapter centered on her daughter, who turned 5 in 2026, and on rebuilding enough physical strength to return to the hands-on wildlife work that first defined her public identity as a child. The family's annual tribute day continues to draw attention nearly 20 years after Steve's death, and Terry has continued describing her late husband's influence as more relevant than ever given the scale of environmental challenges facing the current generation. An annual fundraising gala tied to the family's conservation nonprofit has become a fixture as well, now in its third year and held in Las Vegas. Robert and Terry attended the most recent edition without Bindi, who stayed home in Australia. But the event still drew a wide circle of friends, family, and fellow celebrities, a reminder of just how far the Irwin name has traveled into mainstream entertainment culture without losing its conservation roots. Terry has also continued fighting environmental battles well outside the reach of any camera, including a long campaign that successfully blocked industrial mining on protected land connected to the family's wildlife reserve, along with ongoing research partnerships studying everything from koala health to frog disease at the animal hospital the family runs in Steve's memory. That hospital alone now treats more than 10,000 native Australian animals every single year, a figure that puts the family's actual conservation footprint far beyond anything most casual fans ever see in entertainment headlines about dancing or recovery updates. Even with health struggles, television wins, and an expanding media footprint pulling attention in different directions, the center of gravity in this family has stayed remarkably consistent. Every major milestone in Bindi and Robert's adult lives, from marriages and births to televised championships and public health battles, eventually circles back to the same park and the same conservation mission their parents built from almost nothing decades ago. That consistency might be the most surprising part of the entire story. Fame, illness, and the sheer passage of time could easily have pulled two siblings in completely different directions. Yet both have chosen, again and again, to root their adult identities in the exact place where their childhoods began. What makes this current chapter so unexpected isn't any single headline. It's the cumulative picture. A daughter who spent a decade quietly hiding chronic pain has become one of the more outspoken advocates for women's health in celebrity media today. A son once known mainly as the quieter sibling has become a national television champion, following almost the exact same path his sister carved a decade before him. Both still call the same park home. Both still answer to the same mission their parents built from nothing. And both have shown in very different ways that growing up in the shadow of a global icon didn't stop them from building identities that are entirely, unmistakably their own. It's worth stepping back for a moment to think about just how unusual this entire situation really is. Most children of famous people either fade quietly out of public view once they reach adulthood, or they spend their careers trying to distance themselves from a parent's shadow, so they can be seen as something separate. Bindi and Robert did neither. They didn't run from the cameras that captured their childhood, and they didn't try to reinvent themselves as something disconnected from their father's name. Instead, they built entire adult careers that somehow expanded the family's reach while staying anchored to the exact same piece of land where it all started. That's a much harder balance to strike than it sounds, especially when the person whose legacy you're carrying died when you were still a child yourself. Viewers quickly noticed he had inherited plenty of the qualities that made his father famous, including a fearless enthusiasm for wildlife, but Robert also carved out something distinct for himself. He leaned hard into photography, earning genuine praise for images that blended technical skill with real artistic sensibility, and he became just as comfortable handling crocodiles, venomous snakes, and birds of prey on camera as his father once had been. Over time, he stopped being known primarily as Steve Irwin's son and became a recognizable conservation advocate in his own right, building a fan base through social media and public appearances that increasingly saw him as his own person rather than an extension of his family's history. Then, in 2025, Robert did something that had nothing to do with animals at all. He joined the cast of a major network dance competition, a decision that surprised plenty of longtime fans. The timing mattered in a way that felt almost impossible to script. His older sister had won that exact same competition a full decade earlier, partnered with one of the show's most celebrated professional dancers. Her win had become one of the most memorable moments in the show's history, which meant Robert walked into the ballroom already carrying the weight of comparison before he had danced a single step. Paired with a professional partner of his own, Robert quickly became one of the season's standout competitors. Week after week, he impressed both judges and viewers with steady improvement and an obvious willingness to learn something completely outside his comfort zone. Fans connected with more than just the choreography. During some of the toughest weeks of rehearsal, He was reportedly seen wearing one of his late father's old shirts, a small, quiet gesture that resonated widely with an audience who had grown up watching that same father chase crocodiles across their television screens decades earlier. The season built toward a finale held in late November 2025, where Robert and his partner competed against 4 other finalist pairs, including a well-known social media personality, an Olympic gymnast, an established actress, and the younger brother of a famous actor. Robert competed through that finale while managing a painful rib injury that forced last-minute changes to his freestyle routine. Despite finishing narrowly behind the season's technical frontrunner on the judges' scorecards, the sheer volume of public votes, more than 70 million of them, carried Robert and his partner to the win. In the emotional aftermath, Robert described following in his sister's footsteps as something that meant everything to him. And he later said his sister had told him the win would change his life, a moment that captured just how closely the 2 siblings had tracked each other's biggest milestones despite living such different day-to-day lives. The victory gave the family a rare distinction. The first family in the show's history to produce 2 separate season champions a full decade apart. For Robert, it marked a genuine turning point in how the public saw him, shifting his image from the zoo's quieter younger sibling into a television personality, with a fan base entirely his own. He has continued to describe himself first and foremost as tied to his father's original mission, even as his media career has expanded well beyond the park's gates, including international filming projects and hosting duties tied to the same dance franchise that made him a household name. What would you do if the whole world watched you grow up, and then watched you lose the one person who made you famous? 2 kids once ran barefoot through a Queensland wildlife park while their dad wrestled crocodiles for the cameras. Today, those same 2 kids are adults with their own marriages, their own health battles, their own television wins, and their own version of a legacy that started long before either of them could talk. Steve Irwin has been gone for 2 decades, but somehow his family story is only getting bigger, and where it's headed next might surprise even the people who have followed it for years. Before Bindi and Robert Irwin became household names in their own right, there was a much smaller story unfolding at a reptile park outside Brisbane. Steve Irwin grew up around that park, which his parents had opened in the early 1970s, and he spent his childhood learning to handle animals most adults would run from. In the early 1990s, an American traveler visiting Australia stopped by the park while touring with friends. Her name was Terry Rains, and she had already spent years running a wildlife rescue operation back home in Oregon. She and Steve connected almost instantly, married less than a year later, and turned their honeymoon into a crocodile relocation shoot that would become the pilot episode of what eventually turned into an internationally broadcast series. Their daughter, Bindi, was born in the middle of 1998, and their son, Robert, followed a little more than 5 years later. Both kids grew up essentially inside the family business. Cameras were rolling before either of them could form full sentences, and by the time the show Habia became a global phenomenon airing in well over 100 countries, Bindi and Robert were already recognizable faces themselves. Around this same period, Steve and Terry started a nonprofit focused on conservation and animal rescue work, an organization that would go on to outlive Steve by decades and remains active today. Then came September of 2006. Steve was filming an underwater documentary near Port Douglas when a stingray barb pierced his chest, and he died almost instantly. Bindi was 8 years old. Robert had just turned 2. The loss made headlines around the planet, and the memorial service held at the family's own venue drew an estimated audience of hundreds of millions of television viewers worldwide. Terry made a choice in the aftermath that would define the next 20 years of her life. Rather than step back from the cameras or walk away from the park, she kept it running, describing the decision later as a promise she felt she owed to her husband. In the years that followed, Terry wrote a memoir about their life together, launched an annual tribute day held every November in Steve's honor, and eventually became a naturalized Australian citizen, timing the ceremony to land on the same date as that yearly tribute. She has also spoken openly about never wanting to date again, telling interviewers in recent years that she felt she had already lived out her happiest chapter and had no interest in searching for a replacement for it. Both of her children spent nearly all of their childhood in front of a camera, and that choice drew criticism from people who questioned whether two grieving kids should have been filmed so soon after losing their father. Bindi had already appeared alongside Steve before his death, and within roughly a year of losing him, she had her own television program. Robert's path looked different. He grew more gradually into the spotlight, eventually becoming known first for his wildlife photography, and later for handling some of the park's most dangerous animals on camera in a style that echoed his father's fearless approach. What almost nobody could have predicted back then was just how far each of these two kids would eventually travel, while somehow never actually leaving the family's mission behind. Bindi's adult life took its first major turn when she met a professional wakeboarder named Chandler Powell, who visited the family's park in 2013. The two eventually married there in a small ceremony years later, and in early 2021, they welcomed a daughter they named Grace.